And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Graham Nicholls, English researcher specializing in verified out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences. Graham, thanks for joining me and welcome.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Well, it's my understanding, Graham, that in 1987, you started having spontaneous OBEs. What were you doing when these started happening? Like sleeping or meditating?
At the time, I was just relaxing. I just sort of come home from school is how I remember the first one. And I was just relaxing on my bed. I wasn't asleep. I don't have out-of-body experiences from the sleep state, which has become somewhat controversial, it seems, because most people seem to assume they're the same as dreams and things these days. But actually, I'm not asleep. And in those early experiences, I was just in a relaxed waking state, something akin to maybe quite focused. So something akin to a meditation, but I wasn't drawn or practicing meditation at that point. So yeah, it was just a natural relaxed state, and then it just happened spontaneously.
At that time, I'm assuming that that wasn't your intention. If you even were aware of OBEs, were you?
I wasn't. No, I'd never heard of them. I knew nothing about them. I had somewhat an inclination towards, I guess, spiritual type things or paranormal phenomena, things like that, because I'd had some experiences earlier on when I was around 5 years old. I'd seen an apparition in the doorway of the flat I grew up in. So I did have some leaning in that direction, but I was from a very ordinary background, no religion, no interest in that direction. So yeah, it was quite a surprise, and I didn't know what was happening until later on when I discovered there was such a thing as out-of-body experiences.
It's pretty obvious what an out-of-body experience is, but some people have different definitions of it and what is actually going on.
Well, yeah, I tend to have two categories of my definition, because there is the experiential side of the definition, so what we actually experience and what it feels like, and then there's the actual what might be going on, what we can derive from science or direct experience, etc. So in terms of the experiential side, it's very much usually an experience of traveling or moving away from the physical body as a kind of living ghost or some kind of traveling consciousness. The traveling consciousness is more common than the astral body or the second body experiences. That's again something that people don't know commonly. They tend to think it's a sort of an energy body is the most common, but actually experiencing almost like a traveling awareness, sometimes a sphere, like almost being like an orb or a sphere and moving through space. That's very common. So that's sort of more the experiential side. Sometimes people see their own physical bodies, sometimes they don't, but there's usually that feeling of floating, moving away from the body, etc. Then within the like actually what might be going on, I think it becomes a lot more complicated because we have different theories. We have more the esoteric viewpoint that tends to look at things in terms of lots of bodies. And like I mentioned, actually the majority of people are not even experiencing one body. So it becomes a bit tricky when we go down that road. So I tend to think we're dealing with some kind of mental construct that's combined with psychic ability, psychic experience. So a sort of multi-sensory experience of the world that includes a psychic dimension. So an example, we tend to think that we're now in the world, looking out at the world through our eyes, and the information is coming into our eyes and we're seeing what's going on. But of course, that's also a construct. The information that comes into our eyes is being structured and made into a form by our brains or our consciousness, etc. So I think possibly what might be happening with an out of body experience is something similar, but in a non-local way, almost like a virtual reality that we connect into. So that's sort of where I'm leaning based upon what we know from psychical research, which I've been involved with, and also from other research and understanding of the brain and consciousness, etc.
How do you think the body works? And what I mean by that is the body a vessel for consciousness? Or if we dig deeper, is the body a manifestation of consciousness?
I tend to look at things in terms of that it's fine to say we don't know, I think, with a lot of these kinds of questions. We really don't know ultimately which of those scenarios is true or whether actually something else is true. Um, the whole question of is consciousness fundamental? Is it a thing that then everything else arises as a result of? Is popular in the NDE and OBE area. I'm not sure if I'm convinced by that. I think it could also be that consciousness arises from the brain, from the body, but then there is something within the nature of reality and consciousness and physics, for example, that allows for consciousness, that allows for that wider interconnection of consciousness. So I think it could be either direction. I think it could be that consciousness is fundamental and it leads to the body, if you like, or to life, or it could be the other way around, that it sort of ultimately resulted in that. But I think either way you look at it, there has to be something within the nature of reality, within the nature of physics, etc., the laws of reality that essentially allow for consciousness, or it wouldn't exist. So I sort of lean maybe into that sort of category, but I think ultimately we don't know. And I find that quite exciting, actually. I'm not a person who feels like we have to have all the answers kind of tied in bows. And I think it can be frustrating sometimes when people want to kind of just have a conclusion and an outcome. So the way I tend to look at it is I want to keep exploring and keep uncovering what might be the nature of this experience. And doing that has actually allowed me to get better at having the experiences because I've learned more about how the experience works. So then I've been able to do the verified experiences that very few people are able to do, and then become part of the science area and again get positive results under scientific conditions. So I think the more we understand and the more we keep an open mind and keep exploring, we can actually maybe learn more about what makes the experience work and all of that kind of thing. So I guess my philosophy is very much like the Zen idea of the beginner's mind, Soshen, this idea of trying to explore everything and experience everything as if it's the first time you've ever heard of a concept, if you like.
You've been out of your body and seen it lying there on the bed or on the couch, right?
Yeah.
And you've been out flying around and seeing things in the environment as well, right?
Yeah.
How do you believe that you're seeing things without your eyes? I'm not saying you're not, but I'm just saying, how does that work?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. That's one of the I think that gets actually goes right back into philosophy, and there was a famous criticism of Emanuel Swedenborg on the idea of how you could interact with the physical environment without without the senses, etc. But the thing is, I think that, as I mentioned, I think the brain is possibly creating a construct. It's building information that's coming from another form in another way into the brain. So it's not coming via the senses, but for example, you know, even if you can't see, there could be sound, for example, that could help construct a form of how we understand the world. And I think I'm not saying that it's sound. I'm saying that it can be a different form of sensory information. It can be something that is how the brain interprets that data or that information that's coming from the world around us in some way. So I don't think we are seeing as such. I think you're correct in that. I don't think we are seeing. I think our brains are creating a visual format out of a mixture of our psychology and psychic data. It's kind of piecing something together. And I think that's why people often psychically will get a certain amount of the information correct, but some of it will be mixed with their own psychology, or some of it will be incomplete, etc. And I think that is because we're dealing with an incomplete data set. We're not getting the full picture. It isn't visual, but it's just that our brains naturally create something visual. I mean, for example, in a dream, we see things visually, but we're not seeing anything with our eyes. Our brain is constructing that. So I think in an out of body experience, it can be a similar thing. There's a construct happening out of data that it's accessing in some other way. There are different theories about how that could happen. It could be a quantum connection, for example. Brian Josephson, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics, has an idea of biological utilization of quantum non-locality. So it's this idea that a biological system can use quantum non-locality to gain information about the world around us. And then there's ideas like Orkor from Roger Penrose, who put forward this idea that maybe the microtubules, very, very low level structures in the brain and the body, might be interconnected in some way. And maybe that's how information can arise, and this experience of a wider consciousness or an experience of the world can happen. So I think it's sort of, there are possibilities. There are physicists and people who really understand that side of things who are putting forward models for how it might happen. And I think Dean Radin, another scientist I've worked with, he feels the same kind of thing, that the answer is probably going to be in the quantum realm in some form.
When you use the word construct, it makes me think of the Matrix. Is it possible that our brains are creating some sort of simulation, or are we all in a simulation together?
It's possible. There's some evidence to support that kind of idea. You know, there's some evidence within digital physics, the idea that we could be in some simulation that was created, you know, and it's become extremely advanced and led to the situation we're in. But again, it's an unknown. I think it's a thing that we can put in that subjective possibility category. But I think, again, with ideas and beliefs, I tend to feel it's good to have something that's based on quite strong evidence if we're going to go to a particular worldview or a particular understanding. So I have that as a possibility, but I'm not convinced at this point that that's the answer, I guess is what I would say.
Some people will use the terminology out-of-body experience, and some people will use astral traveling. And along with that, some people say they're the same and some people say they're different. What is your take?
I think really it does come down to semantics. I mean, they are astral travel or astral projection is just the esoteric term that was popularized probably with Hereward Carrington and Sylvan Muldoon, the very, very famous book Projection of the Astral Body, and I think it was about 1929 that came out. So that, I think that really embedded that idea of astral projection into the popular imagination. But I think really out-of-body experience is more just a neutral scientific descriptive term, and astral projection or astral travel is more the esoteric term for the practice of having an out-of-body experience, or intentionally inducing an out-of-body experience. So I think that's all it comes down to. It's just a preference of terminology. I coined independent consciousness experience as a term that I use for my verified or the more objective side of out-of-body experiences, because I realized OBE or out-of-body experience can be too broad a category. So I wanted something that referred specifically to these very objective, very high level, what I would call peak experiences of being out of the body. So I called them independent consciousness experiences. So there's many terms, but it's just preference at the end of the day, I think.
Can you share with us some of your experiences that were verifiable and how you verified them?
Okay, well, probably my most famous verified experience was a precognitive out of body experience of a terrorist attack in Soho in central London. I was teaching the G technique, which is one of the methodologies that I use to induce out of body experiences. It uses a combination of muscle contraction, tension, and intense breathing. So the combination creates the right state for the out of body experience, essentially. So I was teaching that to four people that I knew, and we were going through the techniques and the process. And I started to feel basically that it wasn't actually doing anything. I wasn't really getting any result. And I was starting to wonder, okay, maybe the technique isn't quite right. And almost as soon as I thought that, it was like this kind of wave just hit me. And I went down onto the ground and went into initially like a natural environment. And then from that, I found myself in this blue gray, uh, visually everything was sort of bluish gray green, and I was standing on the corner of Moore Street and Old Compton Street in central London, and it's an area I knew well. I was looking around, saw some landmarks that I recognized, and then there was an explosion burst out about 150 meters away, something like that, in a bar. I just saw the explosion burst out, and then I saw someone run very close by, as if to run and help the people that had been in the explosion. And then I felt this kind of emotional wave hit me in the chest, almost like I felt like the emotion of the people that had been in the attack, and that kind of pushed me out of the experience, and I went into a sort of void. And then several of the other people who were there then started to kind of try and coax me out. They'd become aware that I was in some kind of intense experience, and they were trying to coax me out. And eventually I came out of this void state and came back to kind of normal reality. And I described to everyone that was there what I'd seen in the experience. I said that I felt that it was a precognitive experience. I felt that there was going to be this explosion in a bar in Soho. Described this all to them. I was living in London at the time, so this was somewhere that everybody was familiar with and close to. And then 5 days after that experience, there was an explosion in a bar in Soho on Old Compton Street, exactly as I'd seen it in the out of body experience. So the out of body experience obviously had been witnessed by those people. So that sort of confirmed everything. I'd written all the details down in my diary within probably an hour to 2 hours of the experience happening, which was true of the other people there. So it was verified in that context. And one of the witnesses there's a video on my website where I described that experience in detail, and one of the witnesses also is in the video and talks about their memory and experience as well. So that was sort of the first sort of verified experience. Then I've had more mundane experiences, like perceiving things at a building far from where I was located, and then relaying that to my partner, and then she then supported what I'd seen and verified it as well. And then I also wanted to do this kind of thing under more controlled conditions, because people might say, "Oh, well, it's sort of anecdotal," even though it was written down and verified and all that at the time. But I wanted to do it under more scientific conditions. So initially, I contacted Rupert Sheldrake, who is based in London and does research with telepathy, precognition, different psychic abilities, essentially. And I did some telepathy research with him, some precognition research with him, and got positive results in all of that. I got the highest score he'd ever got on a single trial in a precognition experiment. Then I did work with the Ryan Research Centre and also the Institute of Noetic Sciences. So with ions, I did a micro PK experiment where you try to almost like physically influence photons as they're fired through the double slit experiment, if you've heard of the famous double slit experiment. So I had to try and affect that psychically, which again had positive results. And then I did a 14-week trial with the Ryan Research Centre, which was a mixture of some remote viewing and some out-of-body experiences, where I tried to perceive remote targets that were set up in the US. I was living in Estonia at the time, so I was, not even in the same country, and was trying to perceive the targets. And again, we got many positive results, and overall, it was statistically significant scientifically. So I ultimately did it under controlled conditions as well as had witness verified experiences.
How much control over the experience do you have? And what I mean by that is, one, can you do it at will? And two, once you're out, can you always go to a certain location of your desire? Or do you pop out and you're in some random place and you're kind of not really aware of where you're going?
It's very dependent upon the experience. It's definitely not a situation where everything is just cut and dry and you can do everything in a very exactly the same way as you would physically. I tend to think the experiences that I'm talking about there, the very verified ones, they did tend to be where I didn't know where I was going to go in any particular moment. The scientific ones, obviously, I was trying to see a specific target with a specific outcome, but that is definitely harder to do and requires those peak experiences that I mentioned, where everything is kind of in sync, like you're in flow, like everything's sort of working. I would compare it to an athlete or something like that. You can't do your best performance every single day. It depends on many different factors. So I would say that it is dependent on those things. But I think, I wanted to show that it can be done. It can't be done every time, but it can be done some of the time, and that's why I've kind of engaged with the science, etc. In terms of the at will thing, I think that can be, it's a term that you hear a lot, but I tend to again suggest not using that term to people, because it's almost suggestive of like flipping a button or something. And I don't think anyone actually has OBEs in that way. I think that it is more about creating a context for the experience to arise and allowing the experience to arise, and then inducing the experience, the out of body experience. So I think at will can be. It was unhelpful to me because when I was learning to induce my experiences, we mentioned that I had some spontaneous experiences in 1987, but then that was it. I didn't have more spontaneous experiences after that. But I became interested in the topic. So then in about 1990, I put my focus on learning to induce the experience. And it didn't happen easily. It took me 6 months of hard work to get to the point of having an out of body experience. And I think that the at will thing actually kind of held me back, because I'd heard this idea that you need to will it to happen. And so I don't know, many people I think tend to think when they think of will, they think almost of kind of straining or forcing or, being more almost aggressive in the process. And it was later on that I realized that actually you need to relax and to let go to the experience, not to try and sort of force it to happen. So yeah, for those two reasons, the kind of flipping a switch, I think, is unhelpful to people trying to learn. And so is the idea of sort of trying to force it with your willpower. So I think because my focus really it is about understanding the experience as deeply as I can for my own benefit, but also the people I work with, the people I teach. My intention is to learn as much as I can so I can relay that information to other people and allow them to have their own experiences and to get to do this more effectively. I think that's the great thing about the science. We can learn to do this more effectively than we've ever done it before in the past.
Can you share with us some of the places that you visited while out of your body?
I visited all kinds of environments. I think that's one of the things that I love about it, actually letting the experience unfold naturally, because I might find myself in a jungle in Bali, or I might find myself even in space. I've had a few experiences. For example, one that's very memorable to me was being in the upper atmosphere of the Earth and looking down at the Earth and seeing the kind of angle of the rotation of the Earth and the sort of upper atmosphere, kind of like a mist spreading out in front of me, and just watching that very subtle movement of the atmosphere and the sea and the oceans beneath me. Things like that, very, very simple in a sense, but also profoundly beautiful, and something that's just stayed with me for many years. And then also going to other levels and what seemed to be sort of this vast sort of interconnected consciousness. So one example was I experienced going into, it looked very much like the painting by Alex Gray. If you've ever seen The Universal Mind Lattice by the artist Alex Gray, if people haven't seen it, you can look it up. But it's kind of like a fountain of light, with lots of sort of channels of light sort of swirling around essentially. And I had an experience that looked very much like that, where I went into the center of it. And when I was in the center of it, it was like I was suddenly connected to millions of minds all at once. It was like I could perceive and understand and experience the emotion and the passions and all of the life stories, if you like, of millions of people in an instant. It's not something you can really hold on to after the experience. It was unfortunately, but I felt like I had all of that for that moment. That kind of, I can't say how long it lasted. If time became immaterial in that moment, but when I came back to my body, it was like I'd experienced a completely different way of viewing and experiencing the world. And I think that really shifted me more towards an idea of compassion and empathy, and sort of changed my life in many ways. So that kind of other level, some kind of other reality, I don't know what to put that into. And then also I've been in sort of afterlife type environments as well. The most powerful example, which also had a verification aspect, was a cloud-like environment, very, very stereotypical, I guess, in many ways. Lots of billowing cloud everywhere, and no real distinctive up or down. And I was just floating in space. And up in front of me, there was maybe 100, and I estimated it to be about 150 people. I think it was about 141, it turned out in reality. But there was all these people who they were going through like life reviews. I could literally see their life reviews. I could tell that they'd passed over very recently, maybe even seconds, minutes earlier. And I could perceive all of the details of what they were going through. And some of them seemed to go through that life review process quicker than others, and were kind of passing into the cloud and sort of disappearing. And others were sort of struggling. And there was a man in particular who looked like he worked outside in some kind of construction or something, very kind of worn, sort of leathery, dark tan. And he was struggling with a figure who looked kind of similar to him. So I assume it was probably his father. And he was going through this emotional turmoil with that as he was trying to go through this life review experience. And I had a feeling that I couldn't go closer, which has also been consistent in some of my other experiences. It was like I felt if I crossed a certain point, I maybe wouldn't be able to come back, which is something that you hear in near-death experience accounts as well. So I consider that a shared death experience. Essentially, I was sharing in their transitional process. So that was an incredible environment. And another other level environment would be a sort of the Summerland type environments that you hear about uh, fairly frequently, that look like the Earth, but they're infused with daylight and very beautiful, um, full of kind of huge meadows and mountains. It's like a very idealized form of the Earth, really. And I would sometimes see figures or people in that kind of environment, but they appeared to be almost auric. Their bodies seemed glowing and full of color, and again, sort of almost like instead of seeing their normal appearance, I was seeing their auric appearance. Um, what I should mention with the scenario with the clouds and where I saw all the people, what then happened was it turned out that at the time that I'd seen that, there had been a plane crash and there'd been about 141 people killed, and they matched with they were construction workers. They were people who looked kind of Slavic, which was sort of how I perceived them in the experience. So it seemed to confirm that the experience I'd had was with those people who passed in that crash.
When you saw people having their life reviews, did you see them like looking at a screen, or what was it about what you saw that made you understand, oh, they're having a life review?
I wouldn't call it a screen, but I could see their memories, and it's tricky to describe because I mean I somewhat remember it as being a kind of circular, kind of almost like a dish above their heads or around their heads. But I think that's probably just me trying to translate what I saw. I think really what it was more was when I looked at them, I just got these memories and these perceptions, but I was also able to both perceive those memories and perceive them as they looked at the same time. So it's not something I can do physically or anyone can really do physically. This was something that was distinct to that experience, that I was having this sort of dual awareness where I could see these two things essentially at once. So yeah, it's very hard to sort of put, but it wasn't anything as literal as a scream, but something like that is the nearest we can put it into words.
Were you also experiencing their memories?
I wasn't experiencing the emotion of their memories, or I was experiencing the visual of their memories. I could see maybe somewhat awareness of the emotion that, for example, the man I was talking about, he was obviously struggling. He was obviously in a sort of anguished state. There was a sense of confusion throughout the whole group because I think some of them maybe weren't even aware how they passed. So I knew that it had happened quickly because it seemed they were like, "Where are we? What happened?" That kind of thing. Um, but this particular man, I could tell that he was struggling to go through the life review, and I felt like he had this intense experience with his father, but I didn't know for sure it was his father. There was this sense of somewhat of a distance, like I mentioned, like I couldn't get into his thoughts, but I could share in them to a degree. I could see visuals and glimpses of what he was experiencing. So I sensed that it was probably his father. But then there was a woman on the far side of the group who she passed through the whole process very quickly and easily. So I assume she didn't have these struggles that she needed to work through. So she seemed to just go through it quite easily. So again, you got this sense that some people were not struggling and other people were. There was kind of different emotional frameworks.
Did you see any guides with the people assisting them through the process?
I didn't know. No, they were just. But I felt like they were moving on to another level, though. I felt like this was maybe just like the first environment that uh, they might find themselves, and then I felt like once they'd gone through that life review process, maybe the next stage that there would have been more. But I felt like I mentioned, I felt like I shouldn't or couldn't go any closer. I felt if I did go closer, then maybe I wouldn't be able to come back. So, although I was curious what was beyond that point, I knew that I wasn't supposed to go beyond that point.
Common places that my OBE and or NDE guests encounter while they're out of their body are the Akashic Records, the halls of Amenti, a crystal city. Did you see any of those?
Okay, so this gets into the whole esoteric belief system side of things. Um, Early on in my experiences, when I was about 14, I started working with an esoteric teacher called Douglas Baker, who came from more of a theosophical framework. So he talked about the Akashic records, and his whole framework was based around theosophy, which is where really a lot of these ideas come from. Um, so he also had ideas, like he would say to me that because I was under 18 at the time, he would say to me, well, of course you can't see in color when you're out of body because, of whatever belief he had. And I was aware that, well, no, that wasn't true. He also said that there was a ring pass knot. So there was a point from which you couldn't cross in terms of if you went outside of the earth, you could only go so far. And I'd already gone past that point in my experiences as well. So I guess from that point, I started to have some doubts about some of those kinds of ideas. And then I had a range of experiences on what most people refer to as the astral plane, but I later came to the conclusion that they were more constructed by my own mind, that they were self-constructed, which actually, if you go back to a lot of the esoteric writings from the time, like A.E. Powell, you find that basically even in those writings, they believed that the astral plane was largely illusory and that you shouldn't sort of trust what you perceive on that level. And I've sort of come to a similar conclusion. And part of the reason for that is because I would feel like I'd encountered, say, someone I knew, and we'd actually arranged to try and meet in an out of body experience, and I'd encountered them on that level, and then it turned out what I perceived was not correct to what they perceived, etc. Experiences on that kind of level didn't seem to match up and didn't seem to verify. And when I started to move away from that and started to work more on my own psychology to try and make my perceptions more accurate, my perceptions did become more accurate, like the science I mentioned and the verified experiences. But I found that the astral plane stuff became less reliable. So I think we can access things that maybe we might put into that category, like past events. I had an experience, for example, where I went back to what seemed to be Victorian London, very close to where I lived, and I noticed details about that environment that I was then able to verify. But that experience felt very different to anything I'd had in more of the sort of astral plane category. So it's tricky to kind of say one way or the other whether there's pure objectivity to those things or not. I think definitely some experiences are objective, some experiences are not objective. The frustration I have with many authors and speakers on these kinds of things is they don't tend to focus on evidence in any way and try to kind of get to the verification. So that's why I like to put witnesses in my videos who can back up what I'm saying, or doing the science to kind of really show that, okay, there was some verification to this experience. Because the problem is, even with myself, I keep a degree of skepticism, because if I get to a level and then I can't verify that in any way, that there's nothing that I can be sure of, then because of those experiences that were not as accurate, I have to hold a question mark over it. I put it into my kind of subjective category, and I'm just like, well, it was an amazing experience, but maybe it was true, maybe it wasn't. But I think the great thing is with those levels, I wish more people would try and do things like meet with others and verify it and things like that, because then we would really know like more about those kind of levels, like what are the objective aspects of this experience and what are the more subjective. Because I think there definitely, if we're honest, there definitely are levels or aspects of this experience that are subjective and are not accurate to reality. They are more illusory. So there's a degree of getting beyond that illusory level, which I think even if you look at ancient writings like Buddhism and things like this, they would often talk about there can be an illusory level that you have to get beyond before you perceive the more accurate levels. And I think that's true. And I think it's important to try and do that in this kind of work. But unfortunately, few people seem to focus on that.
Besides seeing dead people out there, have you seen any other beings like angels, aliens, or any other non-human entities?
I have seen entities. Again, it's hard to know what they were. There's always the interpretation factor with these things. For example, I'll mention an experience that happened physically just to give a sort of context. I had an experience with a good friend of mine where we were meditating together, and this orb, maybe around the size of a basketball, opaque, glowing green, floated into the room from the ceiling and moved down to around sort of our eye level and sort of just floated there. And it stayed there probably for maybe 10 minutes. It's hard to estimate how long it was there, but there was just this kind of orb, and it radiated this feeling of positivity, or almost love kind of energy that came from this orb. So we didn't get frightened. We didn't have like a negative reaction or anything. I just remember looking to him and him kind of saying, "Yes, I can see it too." Essentially, he didn't say that, but he kind of nodded. And then afterwards, obviously, we talked about it. Um, but yes, it had this kind of radiating energy. Um, so I interpreted that in a spiritual context, because I guess that's my alignment. But then I remember relaying it to a friend, and they instantly said, "Oh, that was an alien." Um, and either interpretation could be possible. Which one is correct? I mean, I don't claim to have the answer on that. Another example of that was just a few years ago. I was at Avebury, which is the largest stone circle in the world, and I was at West Kennet Longbarrow, which is sort of part of that complex. And we'd been there for quite some hours. It was coming up to May 1st of Beltane, and we were up on this sort of hill, and we were about to sort of leave, but we stopped and just were sort of looking at the environment. It looked very beautiful. It was nighttime, but the sky was very bright and lit. And I suddenly just felt something very, very intensely, this incredible energy. And I just kind of put my hand forward. I could feel the energy in the air. I could just feel it. And I said this to him. Um, and I started to lift my hand, like I was literally following the energy with my hand, feeling it as it moved. And I essentially sort of pointed into the sky, and we both looked into the sky as I was kind of feeling this energy. And then suddenly this huge column of energy appeared in the sky, maybe 200 meters up, massive column. So it was kind of just, it had a beginning and an end, and it was just sort of floating horizontal right above us. But it also felt like energy, because there were kind of, you could almost like see things inside it, possibly kind of like it was moving around, not like beings, but like, like the energy was kind of moving around. um and again, I interpreted that more in a spiritual context, but I think for example, again, other people I relate it to were kind of like, oh, that was a mothership revealing itself to you. So yeah, I find it like, in terms of entities, it can be very tricky, because it's hard to interpret what that actually was. Like even the experiences I mentioned on the other levels with these beings with their auric energy and that kind of thing, they do seem like possibly non-human or possibly some kind of higher being. I have experienced guide-like entities as well. In my first book, Avenues of the Human Spirit, I mention Shah and May, who are these two guide-like beings that I've encountered many times. Are they a part of me or a sort of higher part aspect of me, or are they something completely independent, or are they a mixture of both? I find that an interesting question, but I tend to think like archetypes, these sorts of universal human aspects are a part of that bigger consciousness, a part of that interconnected consciousness. So I feel like they can be both a part of us as individual humans and also part of some bigger system. The same way I think our consciousness is both singular, both our individual personality, but also connected to a bigger system. So that's kind of how I see it.
What are some of the biggest obstacles that people have from having an OBE?
When you say from having,
I mean,
you mean to achieving one?
yes.
Um, I think it's often just in themselves. Maybe there's a lot of misinformation, unfortunately. I think the thing I've learned the most that I try to kind of emphasize to people is don't don't be just chasing the ultimate technique, which is what I think is the biggest pitfall. So many people do that. They just really chase looking for this like master technique. It's kind of like looking for the shortcut to lose weight or something. It ultimately, most of the time, these things don't really work. It's just better to do the work and be consistent. Um, but I think what I've realized with OBEs is the pre-state. It's all about being in a deep enough trance state, being as deep as possible in the right kind of mental, psychological state, the physiological state that allows for the OBE to arise. The context that I mentioned earlier, having that context for the experience to arise, that's the most important thing. And that's really so my approach to teaching is teaching people to get to that core fundamental structure, that context, the foundation that will then allow the experiences to happen consistently. Because the technique is really, it's the final step, like the exiting part or the final bit that gets you out of body is really, it's 10%. The important aspect is getting that foundational deep state in place so that you can then go out of body more consistently. Once you can get there consistently, that then the out of body becomes much more fluent and much easier. So I guess the the biggest obstacle can often be people just having a false idea about what it will be that gets them there and how to get there. There's a lot of focus on that you have to use lucid dreaming, but again, my approach with my work is to work with the individual. What are their particular skills? What are their needs? Like in my second book, Navigating the Out of Body Experience, in that I structure how to approach things in terms of you as an individual. What is your nature? Are you more of a kind of lucid dream person, or are you more of a trance person? Are you more physical? Are you more visual? How are you as an individual? And then creating the program or the approach to inducing an out of body experience based around that information. So you as an individual. So it's like optimizing the structure of the approach to you rather than to just a generic approach that might not work for you because it might not be right for your makeup and your way of being. So that's kind of how I look at things.
I thought the biggest obstacle would be fear. like either afraid that you're going to die and not come back, or maybe some other entity may steal your body while you're out there and then you're stuck. Can you comment on those?
Yeah, fear can be a factor. These days, it's not as commonly a factor, I would say, with the people I work with. I work a lot one-to-one. I do sort of private tuition with this approach as well. And most of the people I work with, it's actually would probably be more impatience or trying too hard or kind of overdoing it would be probably more common than fear these days. But fear it depends again on the individual. Like with all these things, it's very individualistic. So I think maybe if someone's got a religious background, maybe they might have some like fears with that. So it does depend a lot on the individual. But fear, um, I think there isn't anything to fear. I want to reassure people on that level. I think actually quite the opposite. I think these experiences can be very life affirming and very positive. Where fear can be a factor is if you do things via sleep paralysis. Now, on the internet, there's been a huge surge in people saying sleep paralysis is the way to go. I disagree with that. I don't think that you need to do it via sleep paralysis. And I don't teach via sleep paralysis for the reason that it is terrifying. It's a scary experience. It doesn't have anything to do with OBE. You can do OBE from a waking state, from a meditational state, from a mild hypnotic state, from a sleep interruption state, from a, there's many liminal states in between sort of states that can lead to an out of body experience if you approach it right. So it doesn't have to be sleep paralysis. So that if there's a takeaway on the fear factor, I would want people to know that you do not have to focus on sleep paralysis. And if anything, it's kind of the fast food of OBEs. I would say the sleep paralysis method, it's unpleasant. The quality of the experience that arises from it is often of lower quality, and the objectivity of the experience is often less. So I would advise against people going that route. So, but that is often where people, when you read the scary stuff, it's nearly always because they had sleep paralysis or they had an OBE via sleep paralysis, because essentially it's a waking nightmare. So that's, yeah, best avoided. So that's one of the factors I would say. Another one, yeah, is the idea of not being able to get back to your body. But I would reassure people that the more likely scenario is you want to stay out longer, and you come back to your body prematurely. It takes time and practice actually to get to a point where you can stay out of the body longer. So, and again, I think that's also based upon a bit of an old-fashioned idea of how consciousness works and how the experience works. I think really we're not just Russian dolls where there's this kind of thing that pops out and then goes off somewhere. I think it's a better way to look at it is that we are interconnected and our consciousness is more expansive and there are more possibilities within our consciousness that we can connect our awareness to and shift our awareness to other locations. So I don't think it's literally like you can be locked out of your body or anything like that.
What is infraliminal sound?
Infraliminal sound was essentially the sound technology I created because I'd been experimenting with binaural beats, as many people do. And I found that binaural beats, they would put me into a mild sort of meditational type state, but they wouldn't take me closer to what I would refer to as an out of body experience or anything like that. So they weren't really sort of getting me to the point I wanted to get to. But I thought logically, it makes sense that sound would be helpful. It makes sense that we have emotional responses to music, all of this kind of stuff. So and frequencies do adjust our brain state and things like that. That's been known throughout time, from meditational chants, etc., etc. So I thought, okay, what does the science say? What could we understand about how to maybe get to an out-of-body experience using sound. So I did some research and I found that there was infrasound. There was research on infrasound that suggested that infrasound can have an impact on your state of consciousness. It can have an impact on perceiving things that are non-physical, etc. So I started to experiment with infrasound. Then there was the area of hypnosis and subliminal influence, things like that. So then I thought, well, what if I combine these two areas together? What if that might have an impact? So I started to work with sound on the edge of hearing, which is basically what infrasound is. And I would work with creating frequencies that seem to have an effect on my brain in a similar to when I was in the vibrational state. So I used neurofeedback. So via the neurofeedback, I could see what kind of brain waves and different states I was getting into, especially close to an out of body experience or at the vibrational state, which is a key element of the out of body experience for many people. Not all people, but many people. That it's the most common. There is also a void state. There's also auditory transitional stage where you hear auditory buzzing and things like that. So I started to explore those different sound mechanisms, and over time, I developed recordings that use infrasound, use subliminals to initiate the vibrational state. The infraliminal one is designed to initiate the vibrational state, which is essentially the precursor to the out of body experience. So I developed that basically to help people and also to help kickstart it even in myself when, on a day when maybe I'm stressed or tired or something like that, and I need something to kind of help me get to that point, then the infraliminal is designed to do that. So that's essentially what it is.
Can you give my audience any exercises or practical techniques that they can start with, especially for beginners?
I would say, as I mentioned, I think the key is the pre-state with out of body experiences. So I would recommend to everyone start working on getting into a different state of mind, a different state of consciousness. Develop that ability first. That is really the key. So meditational practice. If you don't meditate, start doing a meditational practice. It's been shown scientifically to be very beneficial on many levels, but also advanced meditators do better in psychic research in different experiments. So that you can work on dietary factors. Some people dismiss the idea of a healthy diet being useful for all of this, but it is helpful because if you think about it, what you eat, what you do in your day-to-day life will affect your energy levels, your sleep levels, your concentration, all of these kinds of factors. So think about that. Think about doing some work with sensory deprivation. I have a whole different approach that I use with sensory deprivation that I teach and work with. This space I'm in right now is my own sensory deprivation environment that I use to help get me into the out of body experience. So it's something I personally use to this day. So it's all about that pre-state, like I mentioned. So research, look into the whole pre-state, work on that, and then the technique aspect, the final step is much easier and fluid, and will probably work much easier if you do all that foundational level first.
Is it common for you to have precognitive OBEs?
I wouldn't say it's common, but it's something that is interesting that has happened in my out of body experiences on occasion. Another powerful one was of the 7/7 bombings that happened in 2005. So that was another precognitive experience that I had. Yeah, and I've done precognitive research under scientific conditions, like I mentioned with Rupert Sheldrake and also with the Rhine Research Centre. So I seem to have somewhat of a gift with that. So I guess people who are naturally gifted in a particular direction, that tends to become a feature of their out of body experiences, if you like. So I often find someone who's very visual, like an artist, for example, might be very good at visual things in OBEs, or they might see incredible vistas and incredible imagery when they're out of their body. So I think our personalities do flow into the nature of the experience that we have. So I think that might be why I've had some along those lines.
I would assume our belief systems also have an effect on the OBEs, right?
To some degree, yeah. If we're, like I mentioned, my early belief system that was more esoteric based sort of tended to lead me to more illusory experiences, unfortunately. But since I take that beginner's mind approach of just looking at things as if it's a new experience each time, that tends to lead to a more objective, more balanced types of experience. So I would say to people as well, don't get caught up in any belief system. That just approach it with that open-mindedness, and see where it takes you. Learn from the experience, kind of listen to what the experience tells you. I think ultimately that's a lot of what I've done over the years, is just, oh, okay, when I do this, that happens. Or, over time I've realized that certain colors might mean certain things, or different sensations in my body might suggest certain things. So I've just sort of studied myself in a way. I've kind of modeled the nature of my experiences and refined them over time by doing that. So I would recommend people to take a similar approach.
How long do you think you're usually out of your body for?
Now the most common duration is about 20 minutes. It can be longer, by quite significant amounts, and it can be shorter, but the average is around 20 minutes, and that seems to be around consistent with people. Once you get past the early stages, with OBEs, the early stages of learning the ability, people tend to have short experiences, maybe a few seconds to a couple of minutes. That tends to be the situation for a period of time. And then once you get more stable in the experience and you don't have an emotional reaction one way or the other, because a large emotional reaction tends to destabilize the experience, and then that leads you to find yourself back in your body. So over time, um, the duration gets longer as you become more comfortable and able to be more stable in the experience. So then it seems to average around 20 minutes after that initial development stage.
Are you able to keep track of time while out of your body?
I would say mostly I am. Uh, there have been experiences where, I mean, a very profound one. This is very unusual, so I'll say that before I say it. But I had one experience where it felt like maybe an hour, but then it turned out I'd been out the whole night, like more than a night, like 12 hours I'd been in the experience. But it felt very short to me, only like an hour in my perception, but actually it was much longer. And the same thing can happen the other way. You can have an experience that's only an hour, but can feel like it was 5, 6, 7 hours, or etc. So, it, that doesn't seem to be that common. It tends to be more, time is fairly consistent with what you expect, with some distortion either way, but roughly it does seem to match.
What are some of the misconceptions about the science of OBEs that you hope to debunk through your work?
I think the main one is just, I would say, mainstream scientists and a lot of mainstream people just are not aware that there is any science on psychic abilities in general. I mean, unfortunately, there's not a huge body of work specifically on out-of-body experiences, because of the controllability factor, that out-of-body experiences are more difficult to control consistently, whereas something like remote viewing is easier to do in a more controlled way. So a lot of the research tends to focus on remote viewing. But a scientist I've worked with on a couple of scientific papers, Patrizio Tresoldi in Italy, he's actively doing different research that looks specifically at out-of-body experiences. So there is some, but in terms of misconceptions, yeah, I think the main thing is just that people are unaware that there's any researchers doing psychic research, like looking at precognition, telepathy, remote viewing, all these things. But there is actually really, really good data out there.
I would think that many scientists would say, hey, you go in a room and close the door, and I'll be in this room and I'll write something on the chalkboard, and you have an OBE, and when you wake up, tell me what you saw. How do you deal with that?
Well, as I mentioned, I've done a 14-week study with the Rhine where we basically did do that. Not a chalkboard. They used random images, photographs. Um, I'm currently putting together some of the imagery actually, where I overlay my drawings or sketches. They're not really drawings, just rough sketches, but I overlay my sketches with the photograph targets that from that particular 14-week study. So I did basically do that research, and we got positive results, not on everything, but it was overall statistically significant, and some were 100% hits, you know. So I think there can be a lot of misconceptions, though, even in the way that things are described. Like your example, for example, to give an example, is the writing of chalk on a board. So instantly there's the idea that, okay, your vision would be exactly the same and you would be able to read and perceive that in a very normal way. But what we found, for example, in research is that small three-dimensional objects are easier to see than text, for example. In or objective out-of-body experiences, very few people describe reading text. It does happen sometimes. In one of my veridical out-of-body experiences, I was able to read some text. I wasn't able to read the whole body of text, but I could pick out individual elements of the text. That tends to be more how it is. It's hard to focus. It's hard to read in a very systematic way like you could physically. So it's more like you get like sections of the text. I call it like a zooming effect. I wrote a chapter for a collaborative book called Consciousness Beyond the Body. And in my chapter there, I talk about this sort of zooming effect, because that seems to be how the vision works. It's almost like selectively zooming in on things. But we know from near-death experience research as well that what people tend to see is three-dimensional objects. So we can think of very famous cases. Pim van Lommel's denture case, for example, small set of dentures is what the person perceives. Pam Reynolds, the famous, you know, having her skull drilled with a device that looked a bit like a electric toothbrush, was how she described it. Again, small three-dimensional object. The tennis shoe that was on the ledge in the hospital, another famous near-death case. Again, small three-dimensional object. I can think of another one, for example, a woman having a chocolate bar in a hallway, and the person perceived that because it was out of character with her, I think it was her father, and it was out of character for him. But again, she perceived the chocolate bar, small three-dimensional object. So nearly all the cases we have, not all of them, but the majority of the cases we have, it tends to be a small three-dimensional object that people perceive while they're out of body. And so a lot of what I've been recommending in terms of approaches to experiments is to use small three-dimensional objects. So I think the way the design of the research needs to work with the nature of the experience. And again, because there's generally this assumption that the visuals are absolutely identical to normal vision, which it isn't. It does change and fluctuate, and certain colors, it can be in duotone, so two colors. It can be monotone. It can be, all different forms of vision can happen in the OBE. And so I think this is where it's really important to dig into what people actually experience, rather than the sort of assumptions of it. So I guess that's where the skeptics need to do their homework as well, and understand how the experience actually is.
Where do you see the field of OBE research evolving to, especially with the use of VR and AI?
Oh, wow. I do think that the more we can understand this experience, I think it allows us to engage with consciousness in a way that nothing else can. And I think that if we combine that with technology, I don't know if that's a good idea or not. I'm not gonna go there on the ethics of whether blending the two would be good. I mean, I think AI is still maybe too early in its development to really understand what it's going to be or what it could be. Um, so I'll sort of be cautious on that one, but I think that in some ways that interconnected consciousness that we experience in an out of body experience, AI could potentially be a sort of artificial form of that. Maybe it could be a way for us to interconnect or download some of our own interconnected experience into that. I don't know. Maybe that could help make it more compassionate or more positive and avoid the negative implications that many people talk about with AI. I think that we can't get rid of AI. I think it's going to be here, now. So I think the thing is now to try and steer it in a positive direction, maybe. So yeah, I think the future of OBEs is that we will gain more understanding of it, and hopefully more people will engage with it. And ultimately, I think that will make a lot of people happier, more at peace. I think it does bring you a sense of inner calm and inner peace, if you engage with it in that, avoid the sleep paralysis and all that sort of stuff, and just focus on it in a more consistent, simple, open-minded way, then I think it can have a very positive effect on your life.
What is unique about your new book, Navigating the Out of Body Experience?
Well, I think that it's based upon actual research. It's not just drawing upon old theories and old methodologies and techniques. It's grounded solidly in science. It draws upon my immersive technology. So I mentioned the infraliminal sound, which is one aspect of what I do, but that sound also was developed as part of environments. So I created virtual reality environments at the Science Museum in London that were based on my psychic perceptions of London. So I built a kind of environment based upon that. I've made structures that were designed to help induce an out of body experience. So immersive structures that sort of lifted the individual off the ground. So almost like a flotation tank or something like that, but dry, that kind of lifts the person off the ground. So they're kind of floating using very fine wires. So they feel like they're essentially floating in the air. And then I would use an early form of the infraliminal to help put them in a sort of trance state. So everything that I've learned from that has been put into the book. Then identifying that flow states are probably a key aspect of inducing out of body experiences. So I did a deep dive into those different types of trance states and those flow states and things like that. So I put that into the book in the structure. I looked at nutrition. I looked at different three-dimensional visualization techniques that I developed out of some older techniques that were sort of 2D, and I turned them into like 3D approaches that again make them more powerful for inducing out of body experiences. I looked at consistently what scientifically we know and in terms of statistics, what is the most effective way to induce OBEs for different types of people, both sleep and dream type people and waking conscious sort of trance type people. So I've studied all that because I've been having OBEs for over 40 years now, and I've been teaching them since my teens, basically working with Douglas Baker back then. So I've drawn upon all of that and all of that study of what works for, not for me. I think most teachers focus on what works for them. But the thing is, I am an outlier. I'm sort of someone who's very gifted in this particular area. So I wanted to work out what would help people who maybe have no previous experience, no particular skill in this area. So I tried to develop methodologies that can take someone with no background in this area and get them to a point where maybe they're not going to play Mozart, but they'll be able to have a consistent experience.
For people who want to know more about your book and more about what you're up to, what's your website?
My website is grahamnicholls.com. So that's Nicholls with two L's. On there, they'll find the infoliminal recordings. I have a downloadable video course. There's information about private tuition with me, which also includes, I do a full certification course that people can go through as well. So they can contact me about that. And then there's sort of articles and other information on there as well. So yeah, it's all on grahamnicholls.com.
If people want to ask you questions, are you open to that?
Oh yeah, sure.
Is
Yeah.
there a contact page on your website?
There is a contact page, yeah.
All right. Graham, before we finish up, can you leave us with a last positive message?
I think the most important thing to me is authenticity, to approach everything we do in terms of spirituality, science, whatever it might be, with an authenticity and an openness. Don't get bogged down in belief systems and limiting ways of looking at the world. Be open and see what is out there waiting for us.
Graham, thank you for your message, and thank you for being my guest.
Thank you for having me on.
Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.